Good morning, everyone. Thank you for getting here at this hour for our Asa-kai breakfast with Mr. Steve Herman. I believe it's our first morning brief at our new premises. I could be wrong, but it's certainly the first of 2019. The Chinese have a phrase, may you live in interesting times. In the U.S. in the last 2 years, where Steve has been based, in particular, would qualify. Shortly, we're going to learn the latest from Washington, as well as what it means for Japan and Asia. However, before I briefly introduce our speaker, let me kindly ask you to turn your phones to man mode or off entirely. It's my pleasure to welcome my friend and former Board of Director colleague, Steve Herman, back to the FCCJ after a few years. Steve is White House Bureau Chief for Voice of America, and that means he's traveled to more than a dozen countries, rode on Air Force One more than 50 times since February 2017 alone. You may have seen him as an active questioner during White House press briefings, which appear on hold for the moment, along with the U.S. government, for that matter.
That's right.
But his time in Washington followed 26 years in Asia, 16 here in Tokyo. In that period, he was on multiple foreign correspondence boards, including his own tenure as president from 1997 to 98. He also served a one-year term as president of the Seoul Foreign Correspondence Club and as governor of the Overseas Press Club of America. He joins us as the U.S. government is entering its longest shutdown in history with little sign of an end to the impasse. Trade wars are being mulled on multiple fronts, including potentially with Japan. The U.S. has announced a pullout, now being rethought from Singapore, from Syria slightly.
Yes.
That sparked key resignations, including the Secretary of Defense. And by the way, we have a new Congress in the U.S. with a Democratic majority in the House that has just taken seats with a new speaker. What does this mean for the year ahead? Well, with all of the answers, please welcome our speaker, Mr. Steve Herman.
Thank you, Dan. Well, I'll make one correction. I do not have all of the answers. Like you, I have a lot of questions on a day-to-day basis. And what I'd like to do briefly is make a brief presentation, mainly to sort of outline the Trump thought process as much as I can fathom it, and also to give you a little bit of insight as to what it's like to cover the president on a day-to-day basis. I actually started covering the administration in February, about a month after the inauguration. I had, as Dan said, gone back to the United States after 26 years in Asia. And I spent the first 6 or 8 months as VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent, which was mainly traveling with John Kerry. And then shortly after the inauguration, VOA decided to make some changes on its beats in Washington. And myself, along with another veteran foreign correspondent of VOA, Peter Heinlein, who has since retired, were sent over to the White House. The joke was that both of us had vast experience covering autocrats and fragile democracies. Say of that what you will. In my presentation, all of the photographs that you see, except for the ones that I'm in, were taken with my iPhone. So what I'm usually doing when I'm in the Oval Office or on Air Force One, the Roosevelt Room, I'm a pool reporter. Does anybody not know what a pool reporter is? Okay, a couple people. So the way it works is, obviously on Air Force One, there's a limited amount of space for journalists or in the Oval Office. So there is a daily rotational pool of journalists from different media who represent all of their colleagues. There are some permanent members of the pool, such as AP, Reuters, Bloomberg, so they will have someone in the pool every day. And there are also pool photographers, and then one television network, which will be a crew of 2 or 3. So, and I think the TV pools actually rotate on a quarterly basis. And then for VOA is in the radio pool, which is a daily rotation. So on average, a couple of times a month, our turn comes up at the White House. You might be standing by all day because there's nothing on the president's schedule, and then all of a sudden, there is an announcement overhead on the speakers for the pool to gather at the Palm Room doors, and we'll be going into the Oval Office. Trips are arranged in advance. There's another rotation for that, which is a smaller rotation. And as we saw a couple weeks ago, there was a secret trip where the president went to Iraq, and reporters were summoned to be out at Andrews Air Force Base at midnight, having no idea where they were going. In fact, it wasn't until, I think, about 30 minutes outside of Iraq on Air Force One that they were informed that they were about to land in Iraq. So, a little bit about Donald Trump and covering Donald Trump. As you know, you've heard this phrase 1,000 times, America first. This is what he ran on, and this is what he says that he is implementing. But what does that really mean? Well, from the perspective of those of us covering him on a day-to-day basis, what we observe, based on his words and actions, is he's looking to even the playing field globally and then win for the United States. And what are wins for Donald Trump? Well, he likes to have things that are visible. He likes to have letters of intent or memorandum of understanding with other countries where they have agreed to X amount of billions of dollars of trade deals and things he can hold up and demonstrate to his base that he is delivering on his promises. For the military, it means more planes, more ships, more tanks. And it means to weaken or abandon global trade referees, for example, the WTO. Trump believes that rules are not fair in the post-World War II liberal world order. So American companies shouldn't be hobbled by playing with unfair rules, hence the withdrawal from the Paris Accord and his disdain with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Geopolitics, Trump, the traditional American values for the president. Aid is tied to trade. In fact, anything is tied to anything else now. It's very transactional. I think what we've seen in this part of the world is traditionally the United States may have its differences with countries such as Japan on trade, but that would never spill over until the military alliance. But with Donald Trump, everything is on the table all the time. He has a relatively simplistic view of the world, where you could say that he divides the world up into different types of countries, which I'll get to in a minute, but his enemy's enemy is his friend. So if you're puzzled over why he has been defending Saudi Arabia so strongly, especially in light of the killing of Khashoggi in Turkey, well, Saudi Arabia is the enemy of Iran, and Iran, for whatever reasons, is considered still to be the enemy of the United States. And of course, going back to the Paris Accord and weakening of the Environmental Protection Agency, strategic resources are put as a priority over the environment. Probably none of this is a surprise to people in this audience. And for Trump, a good president is a strong president. His strong presidents that he's mentioned, or we can observe from his actions, are presidents like Andrew Jackson, who was quite a controversial president and is getting a bit of historical revisionism lately, Teddy Roosevelt, LBJ, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan. And all the weak presidents are probably every Democrat since Lyndon Johnson, and both of the Bushes, who are members of the Republican Party. With Trump, it's all about chemistry and cash. He reportedly told Angela Merkel, not at this particular moment of the photograph, but at another meeting, "You owe me $1 trillion." okay? Very confrontational in regards to NATO. The hubris of the personal relationship and the transactional is what we see playing out every single day. And as other leaders have found out, flattery will get you everywhere and then perhaps nowhere. We've seen this in his relationships with Abe, Macron, Merkel, Putin, Trudeau, and Xi. I would argue that perhaps Shinzo Abe has, of all the foreign leaders, has had the best relationship with Donald Trump. Abe was very, very smart in going to see Trump at Trump Tower in New York City after he had been elected president. He is on the phone with him frequently and seems to know how to manage Trump better than most other world leaders, notably Angela Merkel. And I would argue that Xi Jinping and, of course, Vladimir Putin are the other ones who seem to have enjoyed a good relationship with Trump. So Trump basically divides the world up into the good, the bad, the in-between, and the inconsequential. And most of the world is inconsequential. The good, India, Israel, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, and interestingly, Vietnam. Bad, traditionally, some of these are not a surprise: Cuba, Iran, Syria, Venezuela. But I would put Germany presently in that category as well. And then there's also an interesting dynamic with Pakistan as well. In between, he can say good things or bad things about them, including straight on the telephone to their leaders or to their faces. Our allies in the EU, Australia, Canada, Russia, Turkey, China. And it could be argued, I think, that as far as the Koreas go, that there really isn't that much difference to Donald Trump between North and South Korea. He enjoys, as we know, a good relationship with Kim Jong-un after the original Little Rocket Man taunts. In fact, there's a report now that Kim Jong-un's on a train to Beijing and should be arriving in a couple of hours. Not confirmed, but I heard that earlier today. And there was also speculation in was it Munghwa Ilbo in Seoul yesterday that the second Trump-Kim summit could take place in Hanoi. Is there anybody want to bet any money on that one? So that would be interesting. But that sort of, it's got to be a country where both the U.S. and North Korea have diplomatic relations. It's probably got to be a shorter or equivalent distance to Singapore from Pyongyang. So I'm not going to argue with that one that it could be Hanoi. Have you heard, you have any insight into that?
No, but you know, he obviously was supposed to go to Seoul. That didn't happen.
Right.
So maybe this is more smoke and.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and then the rest of the world, in Donald Trump's eyes, is relatively inconsequential. The so-called shithole countries, most of Africa. And once in a while, things will pop up on his radar screen. We just interestingly sent some troops into Gabon last week, which were supposed to be there for instability in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then we had an attempted coup in Congo yesterday. So that was kind of.
Yeah. The coup was in Gabon, right?
Gabon, yeah, in Gabon yesterday. So. And sometimes I wonder just how much he is paying attention to the rest of the world, even important geostrategic areas. A couple of months ago, in the Oval Office, I was part of the pool, and after I finally got my question in after Jim Acosta tried to cut me off after Jim had asked 3 questions in a row. We'll talk about Jim in a few minutes. But I asked the president about a freedom of navigation passage by some U.S. Navy warships through the Taiwan Strait that had happened a couple of days ago. And Trump got very defensive and was basically saying that's for me to know and you to find out. But it was already something public. And then I realized he apparently didn't know about it. or had forgotten about it. Not that it was a super big story, but that would have been something that had been in the PDB, what's called the President's Daily Brief. What we do know is that for President Trump, the PDB has been streamlined to about a page and a half, 2 pages, with maps and charts and graphs, as opposed to, I guess, Obama, it was like a 13-page document. So make of that what you will. We've seen operatively that he believes he knows best and to never admit a mistake. He is a self-proclaimed high-intelligence person who believes it's better to act with the gut than use brains. Those are actually based on his words, not mine. The one time where I saw a little bit of self-doubt, where I could see on his face, maybe this wasn't a great idea, was this event in the Oval Office with Kanye West. And you can see me over there holding a boom mic on the left with a tense expression on my face, mainly because I have to hold that damn thing up and try not to hit anybody for sometimes up to an hour at a time, and make sure the batteries aren't running out, and trying to get out pool reports and let people outside the Oval Office know what's happening, because there's no live broadcasts when we're in the Oval. But my print colleagues, and you'll notice sometimes on Reuters that there are bulletins coming out, because the Reuters reporter doesn't have to hold anything else. They actually go into the Oval with 2 phones, I've noticed. One is sort of an open mic back to the Reuters newsroom. So you will see on the wires the bulletins coming out before you'll see it on TV. But this was a remarkable day, because it was the first time that a string of expletives were heard in the Oval Office with reporters present. Kanye West, of course, the one uttering those. And he was also slamming repeatedly on this Resolute desk, which is sort of the Liberty Bell of American furniture, right? It's the most iconic piece of furniture. But it's a strong piece of wood, and it held up very well, despite the banging from Kanye West. Yes, it came out very clearly. As we've seen, Trump has a disdain for multilateral agreements. He likes to bond in the bilateral agreements, and this plays very much to his base. Populism plus nationalism is meant to maintain the support with the base. He's really not interested in expanding his support. It looks like the key is really, if there is a strategy, to just holding the base, keeping the base enthusiastic. And if you have questions about the government shutdown and why he's being so stubborn about that, it's not because of any issues really with the Democrats, but because of the pressure he's getting from the right, from Sean Hannity and Coulter, who say that if he caves on this, he will not be reelected. So the pressure on Trump is actually coming from the right, and it's a threat to his base. He can slam the Democrats as much as he wants, and it's not going to cost him any support with the base. As you know, Trump is all about disruption. That's probably the key word, and he would see that as a positive word. That's why he got elected. That's what his followers wanted, and that's what he's doing. He makes policy pronouncements via Twitter, attacks, fires people. It is a short circuit to the base. He doesn't need to go through the media filters, and he's looking to dominate and alter the news cycle. This is a picture I took on Air Force One back in the press cabin. This is a bit unusual because he's not wearing a suit and tie. Usually he's in suit and tie on Air Force One, but if we're going off to look at a disaster site, then he's more casually dressed on the plane. And he'll come back without any notice whatsoever. So the problem is, if you're on a long flight, like I was on a flight from the G7 in Canada to the Kim Summit in Singapore with a 3 a.m. fuel stop in Crete. And basically, the secret of doing these trips is, because you're going to hit the ground running, is you take a pill to knock yourself out on the plane. Otherwise, you'll just be totally frazzled. But with Trump, you really can't do that, because he could come back at any time, and you can't be unconscious, because you'll miss what he's saying. And a lot of times he'll come back, and the press aide or press secretary will say, this is off the record. and he'll talk for 20, 30, 40 minutes, and then a wire service reporter will say, hey, you know, that part about Nancy Pelosi, can we put that on the record? And he'll say, yeah, sure. And so then there'll be this negotiation about what is now going to go on the record, and it can get very confusing. So what I've learned to do is, even if it's off the record, just try to record it from the very beginning, and unless I'm told explicitly by the president or the press secretary not to record. But usually the TV cameras are not rolling unless he's coming back to make an on-the-record statement on Air Force One from the beginning, which is rare. And you'll also notice the TV is on Fox News. Fox News, if we're over a coverage area, is always on the monitors. Sometimes sports comes on, golf, football, but never CNN. I was at the Putin Helsinki meeting. We had a very interesting incident there where someone got White House press credentials to be in the room and turned out to be an anti-nuclear activist from Washington, D.C. and started shouting, disrupting the event. That was kind of interesting. And then we saw Putin hand Trump this soccer ball, which he then tossed to Melania, sitting in the front row. And yes, this ball was x-rayed by the Secret Service before it came back to the White House. Now, this is from the Rasmussen poll, which is one of the polls that Donald Trump actually likes, as it tends to show him in a more favorable light. But this will show you since January, this goes back to January 17, so back to the inauguration. And you can see there has not been a tremendous flux with those who strongly disapprove or strongly approve of the president, despite all the things that we've been through. Now, this is also a very interesting chart that I dug up. It's called the Trade Policy Uncertainty Index Value. And this goes back to 2013, and I wanted to show this one because it's got Japan in orange on the top and the U.S. on blue at the bottom. And you can see that where Trump wins the election and then takes office and withdraws from the TPP, that this spiked in the U.S., but especially here in Japan. So this reflects, I think, the greater level of nervousness overseas, and especially here in Japan with Trump's policies. Yeah, okay, that's the one I wanted to show. So what happened, of course, Trump went directly from running his own family company to the White House. He never held political office. He was never a mayor, a congressman, a senator, a governor like most other U.S. presidents, never served as vice president. And he runs the White House exactly like he ran his company. He believes that only family can be trusted, and this is a family outfit. Cabinet members are meant to conform. He has informal consultations with everyone. He'll talk to his personal physician and say, you know, do you think I should fire John Kelly? Maybe you'd like to be chief of staff. I mean, these sort of conversations actually happen. A minor level aide can be consulted on foreign policy matters. He talks on his cell phone at night to country club members who call him up, and he'll watch what the commentators on Fox News are saying, and then we may see a tweet a few minutes later, which may alter U.S. policy. Palace intrigue and turmoil is good and fun, according to Donald Trump. Again, much the way he ran his company, he likes to see people fight it out, see who listen to all sorts of provocative arguments, and sometimes things stick with him. But at the end of the day, there's only one boss, and that's Donald Trump. So it doesn't matter what your background is, whether you've been a career general, an intelligence officer with the CIA for 40 years, or you were in the Senate for decades. Trump believes that he knows best. Now, what we do know, he is a master at playing the media. He had this New York City model. that worked very well for him, providing fodder to the tabloids. And I think he's really been puzzled why Washington does not conform to this New York City model. And he is still courting the press. Despite what he says, fake news, enemy of the people, he still leaks stories to the New York Times. He still is talking to the media on a regular basis. He does show favoritism, of course, to Murdoch properties. He's given somewhere around 42, 43 interviews now, I think, to Fox News or Fox Business News, outlets that are owned by members of his country club or big donors to the Republican Party, such as Sheldon Adelson, who owns the Las Vegas Review-Journal. There's a conservative publication, which most of you probably have not heard of, called Newsmax. There's One America News Network. These all get a disproportionate amount of attention from Donald Trump. But as a reporter, he is, I think, inarguably the most accessible president ever. We have up to a half a dozen media availabilities a day with him, plus leaks. So there is a tremendous amount of information that you can get directly from the President of the United States if you are a White House reporter, especially if you're in the pool. You can ask him questions very frequently. So, you know, there's been a lot of fuss made about, oh, he hasn't had very many formal news conferences. But I actually think the more casual interactions are more valuable because you can have a group of reporters in a relaxed environment really press him on issues instead of these more orchestrated type of events. Frequent Oval Office sit-downs with both friends and enemies. I think in the last couple of months, a group of reporters from Reuters had a sit-down, from Wall Street Journal, New York Times. But as we all know, for Donald Trump, never let facts ruin a good narrative. And it's okay to make it up as you go along. It'll all come out in the wash. It really doesn't matter. And in the way that some of his aides try to explain this away is like, well, it's more about the direction that the president's trying to go in rather than specific facts. But as we've seen, there's now a greater amount of pushback from the mainstream media to these casual relationship with the facts. And then there's also this debate about whether news articles should say that the president is lying. But to lie, I think most people would say you have to know that what you're saying is not true. And I would argue that as reporters, we usually cannot read the president's mind, and we don't know whether what he's saying, if he actually believes it or knows it not to be the truth. So just a few scenes. At the G7, there was an impromptu news conference. I think that was actually his first news conference of his administration. And there were literally only 6 reporters in the room for that because it was announced on 10 minutes and was only available to those of us in the traveling pool that was going on Air Force One that day to Singapore. So I got to ask the first and I think the last question at that G7 news conference. This gives you a little bit of insight into how it looks for us when we're traveling. I'm usually on a knee or trying to hunch over to stay out of the view of the cameras to get a microphone into his face on the airport tarmacs. And again, he can just come out and sometimes have these impromptu discussions that can go on for 10, 15 minutes. The upper right-hand side, that's what our view looks like in the motorcade when I'm in pool van 2 or pool van 3. So this is the protective press detail. If something happens, we're supposed to be able to report it. That van in front of us is pool van 1. And there's actually sort of a what do you call it, a open roof, a lid that pops open, and the TV cameras can pop in there and shoot forward and hopefully see the presidential limousine if something were to happen. When we're on Air Force One, we do not have access to Wi-Fi. We can only use a telephone for what's called a wire call when there's something extremely urgent. I've done one of those. It's like something out of the 1970s where you ask the Air Force One operator to place a call to your newsroom. They then call you back. You have to hold down 2 buttons on both sides of the handset at all times to be heard. And it's something from decades ago where you're dictating your brief pool report. So when we're on the helicopter flying somewhere, we can get a cell phone signal over a city, and then we'll work on our pool report. So that's on the helicopter, one of the helicopters there. And the White House daily press briefings are no longer daily. They've turned into maybe sometimes monthly, but they are usually covered live. I think MSNBC recently has stopped broadcasting them wall to wall, but most of the reporters, I would say, who are sitting in the seats will get called on. So frequently, I'm usually asking questions about geopolitical issues. I'm one of the few that will ask questions about Asia, because questions usually go to the first row reporters, the wires, the TV networks. They're usually asking about the Mueller investigation, Stormy Daniels, the president's tweets, attacking whoever. So VOA, we have 45 language services. We broadcast from the United States to the rest of the world. So for my audience, I want to try to get in a geopolitical question. I usually don't get very thorough answers because obviously it doesn't seem to be a big priority for this administration. They're much more focused on domestic issues. The upper left is that infamous East Room news conference with Jim Acosta. If you have questions, we can talk about that. But the remark that I would make concerning that is the president was the one who called on Jim Acosta. And Jim took the bait, and then the president sort of bashed him. And you can argue perhaps that that was a bit of an orchestrated event. But if the president really hated Jim Acosta in CNN so much, why did he call on him? Or was he just looking for a fight? The lower left-hand side is called Pebble Beach. This is out on the north driveway outside the West Wing. These are permanent tents for all of the TV networks. So if you're a TV reporter, you can be out there as early as 5 o'clock in the morning or as late as 11 o'clock at night. They do have little space heaters there because it obviously gets kind of cold out there, and they'll put some fans out there in the summer. But it is not a glamorous posting by any sense, I would argue. In the middle is the VOA booth. We have what's called a double wide, which means we can barely fit 2 people in there. The wire services have the largest booths upstairs. We're downstairs. We cannot control the temperature. It is a brisk, I don't know how to convert this into Celsius, but 68 Fahrenheit, usually in the booth year-round. So I wear thermal underwear when I go to the White House, regardless of the season. And the lighting is really bad, and it causes a lot of eye strain to sit in there. Upper right-hand side of that chart is the seating for the press briefing room. That is not controlled by the White House. That is controlled by the White House Correspondents Association. So, and they will change it out, make adjustments every couple of years. Obviously, this is prime real estate, and some of the seats are shared. So one day it'll be one outlet, and then another day they have to take turns. There is one seat for the foreign press as well. And in the lower right-hand side is our access to food in the White House. And when there's a government shutdown like there is now, the vending machine does not get refilled. And the very last thing is the tuna on crackers. So that's when you know things have gotten absolutely desperate. My heroes at the White House are the Secret Service, both the uniform detail and the president's protective detail, because they're also guarding us when we travel with the president. And people shout at us fake news. Nobody's thrown anything at us or attacked us yet, but we do have a Secret Service agent when we're part of the protective bubble to make sure that we don't get contaminated by anybody from the outside. And I will tell you one incident we had in Pyeongchang in Korea when I was with the vice president. The South Korean guards were trying to prevent us, the vice president's pool, from getting in the room with Pence and Moon Jae-in and Abe. Shinzo was also in that room too. And the Secret Service agents, much to their credit, shoved aside the South Korean presidential detail and pulled us into the room and tossed us into the room. So they're my heroes because they protect us and help us to do our job. And these are just a couple more shots I took. On the left was a rally in my home state of Ohio, and then on the right-hand side is a figure that you may recognize who's been in the news lately. So with that, I'll stop because I used to be a moderator for these events, and I thought, I hope the speaker shuts up soon so the audience can ask some questions. So back to you, Dan.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. Very well, not only narrated, but the pictures, I think, quite distinctly illustrated what the last 2 years has been like. We're going to open up the floor for questions, first to our working press. And if you would identify yourself, your organization, try to limit yourself to one question, and as always, no speeches. If no one immediately throws up a hand, then I've got one.
Okay,
so we're having a very kind of collegial morning press briefing here, one of hundreds, if not thousands, over the years at the Foreign Correspondents Club. The image, not just the Acosta moment, but in general of the press briefings, since, let's say, over the 2 years that you've been there, is not that. And they may be held in kind of infrequently now, but it appeared to be quite not just argumentative, but increasingly a frustrated press was not putting up with no answers. Similarly, the situation with Acosta and actually throwing him out, I assume he's back in the pool, but any updates on your sense of it sitting through this, and are we seeing potentially the end of, at least for the Trump next 2 years, of the organized press conference?
Well, I think what is evident is that even when Sarah Sanders, or before her, Sean Spicer, gives an answer, it can be contradicted very quickly by the president in a tweet. So with Sarah Sanders, I have a little bit of empathy for what she has to do, and people have said, yes, she should just resign. But I think if you were to poll the White House press corps, they would agree it's much better dealing with Sarah Sanders than it was Sean Spicer, because what you see on television is a very minor part of the job of the White House press secretary and the press team. We are bombarding them with emails all day long, or walking back into their offices trying to get answers to questions. And when the television cameras are on at those briefings, it's a little bit orchestrated. Sarah's playing to an audience of one, or you could argue she's also looking at how the base is going to see her performance, and if she's beating up on reporters, then she looks good with the base and she pleases the president. The reporters want to be seen, some of them, as confronting the press secretary, and that they're not going to take this guff. And I mean, how many of you think that the answers that come out of those briefings are actually of really much value? So most of the work of a White House correspondent is not sitting around and waiting for the infrequent press briefing and hoping we get a gotcha question into the press secretary. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, and I would argue that when the cameras are not on, I don't know if I would call it collegial, but it's much more civilized. And also there are those of us who believe that when we're in the Oval Office, that even if the president or Kanye West are not maintaining a sense of decorum, that the Oval Office is an institution. It's the presidency rather than the president himself. And we shouldn't be yelling and screaming. And so I think the majority of correspondents adhere to that. And then Reuters, for example, has an incredible White House correspondent named Steve Holland, who has a Southern accent, sort of more of a Bill Clinton laid-back type of way of speaking. And I think he's able, with that style, to extract a lot more out of Donald Trump than somebody who's asking questions in an accusatory tone or stating an opinion. Just like you said, don't get up and make a speech here. I don't think it's our job in front of the president to get up and make a speech. And I would also say, if you were just depending on the interactions with Sarah Sanders and the president to write your stories about the presidency, then you're not doing a good job. On the other extreme, there's the sort of advocacy reporting and the polarization, and that's one thing I noticed when I went back to the U.S. after 26 years. Just as the middle had fallen out of the political spectrum in the United States, that also had seemed to happen with the majority of the media, especially the television media, and where you have Fox News and other networks on the right, and CNN and MSNBC on the left. And if you were to try to do, I think, a reasoned, middle-of-the-road approach to this presidency on television, you probably wouldn't have any ratings. If you want that sort of intellectual approach, there is the PBS NewsHour, which is an excellent program, but probably gets about 1% in the ratings. So that is out there. But it was very disheartening for me, as a bit of a culture shock going back to the U.S. after all the years here, to realize that a well-researched article probably was not differentiated by the majority of Americans than some total conspiracy theory appearing on Facebook. People I think are just looking to have their views reinforced, not to be challenged, maybe because it's a very unsettling time for people, whether you're on the right or on the left, that they just seem to want their own worldview reinforced and don't want to be challenged. That's my only take on it. But the other thing is, I think we're in some sort of paradigm shift with not only the media, but politics globally. Because let's look at what's happening in the United States is not an isolated phenomena. Look at the leadership now, the changes in Brazil, Italy, Hungary, and maybe what's going to happen soon in France or Germany or the UK. There's something going on, and we say journalism's the first draft of history, and I don't claim to know what is really going on from a macro perspective yet. I'm just trying to grapple with covering it on a day-to-day and trying to make a little bit of sense out of it for our audience in the rest of the world in objective of a manner as possible.
All right. Yes, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome back to the club.
It's a pleasure to be back.
My name is Yoshi Hota. I'm a freelance journalist.
Yes.
I have a question on Trump's personnel management. If I look back in the last 2 years or so, it's been taking a zigzag road. He all of a sudden fired Mr. Tillerson by Twitter. And recently, James Mattis and Trump didn't agree on the Syria. So Mattis decided to leave the cabinet. Do you see any political infighting inside of the White House among the aides and the cabinet members? Or do you see many yes men left? What do you think?
Yeah, great question. I'll give you a paradoxical answer, which is yes to both. There are a lot of yes men and women in the White House, at least when they're talking publicly or speaking to the president. And yes, there is a tremendous amount of infighting, divisiveness in the White House. But again, as I mentioned in my remarks, that's not something that the president seems to mind too terribly. If you look at China policy, for example, where you've got someone who was sort of a fringe economist brought in, like Pete Navarro, who's dealing with some of the more traditional people like Robert Lighthizer at USTR and arguably Steve Mnuchin at Treasury, who all have inputs into the formulation of trade policy. And Trump likes to see them fight it out. And he may sometimes go with what he considers to be the most provocative and unconventional view. And also, he negotiates the same way that he negotiated New York real estate, which is you have an adversary that you want to get something out of, come out with a provocative, ridiculous position, hope that your opponent will fold. And if not, well, maybe you reach a compromise. I mean, look at the swing we've seen with North Korea. Okay, from little rocket man to, practically I'm in love with the guy, right? Where is it going to end up? We don't know. Are we going to be back at little rocket man in 3 months? I don't think anybody would be shocked if that happens. And so that's what we're dealing with. And on some of these foreign policy issues, for example, China trade, I think that's one area where the hard line is actually being cheered by a lot of the U.S. allies who have been frustrated with China's violations of the WTO, and they're happy to have Trump out there and see how far he goes. That gives them a little bit of cover, and hopefully things will adjust a little bit. And the talks are going on right now. There's already a tremendous amount of tariffs and counter tariffs that have been put into place. And so I would say that his style is definitely high risk, confrontational, provocative, and I would say as far as international policies, whether it's Syria, North Korea, China trade, it's probably too early to render a verdict on whether these are going to be successes or failures. They could be. I think there'll be one or the other. There'll either be spectacular successes or spectacular failures, because that's the way that this administration is approaching things.
Sorry, excuse me, just to follow up, you had said that Prime Minister Abe has been one of the perhaps more successful global leaders in his relationship with Trump, but some would argue that he did this essentially by being flattering, by kind of starting the relationship, I think with, I can't remember, what, gold golf clubs or some kind of gift of some sort, and that really it's a position of weakness that makes for good photo ops for each of them, but may not end up in the policy balance, particularly as it heads towards what might be trade considerations for Japan as well.
Yeah, well, I think, again, it's probably too early to render a verdict. But let's look where we're at almost 2 years into the administration. Trump is beating up on China rather than Japan on trade. He hasn't pulled out U.S. troops from Japan. Okay, the Okinawa issue will be interesting to see how that one plays out with Henoko. He also hasn't said to Abe, you owe me $1 trillion. Okay, so, arguably so far so good. I would say that when we did an interview with him in Buenos Aires at the G20, he made a statement which didn't make the news, and you'll see why in a minute, that he had just spoken to Abe again, And Abe had told him about a new deal that there would be 2 Japanese automakers who would be building additional plants in the United States. And I was sort of live tweeting, and I'm like, I don't think so. And what I realized is Abe was, in a sense, reminding him of the previous deal. I think it was Nissan and Mitsubishi for, was it Alabama? There's going to be a new plant, Mississippi, in 2020. And so maybe what Abe is doing is sometimes just repeating things he said before. Trump thinks it's a new announcement, and he's very happy because, yes, the Japanese are putting in more plants in the United States. So, or did Trump really know it was not new but wanted to repeat it and act like it's new? I don't know. That's why I can't say, the president's lying. But you can say he's mistaken, or he's misinformed, or he doesn't recall correctly. And that was one particular example with Japan, because immediately after that, I went back in the press room where there were some Japanese reporters, and I said, hey, what Trump just mentioned this, and we all sort of agreed that this was probably that previously announced deal.
All right. Yes, sir. We have no other press?
Mitsuya Goto, if you recall.
It's good to see you, Goto-san.
Nissan spokesman. Back in...
Maybe you can answer. Is there another new Nissan announcement coming on a plant in the U.S.?
1993, August 18th, Donald Trump addressed the professional luncheon meeting of FCCJ, and that was a picture taken then.
Okay. He has more hair.
Yeah.
It's a different color.
Anyway, on May 30th, I wrote him another letter, and I said I noted in the Twitter that he was concerned about his thinning hair, so I sent him a bottle re-up X5.
Oh, okay.
And in the letter, I said, don't impose 25% duties on Japanese cars and steel. U.S. automakers, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, all retreated from the Japanese market way back. Blame GM, Ford, and Chrysler, Fiat. Japan also, excuse me,
Could you ask a question?
ordered 100 F-35A, and that should please Donald Trump. What do you think Donald Trump will do to Japan? I know he's having a wonderful time with Abe.
Yeah, well, again, so far so good, and the more planes and train, well, there are not going to be any trains going from the U.S. We could use some more Japanese trains, believe me. But yeah, big budget items that are purchased by Japan will definitely please Donald Trump and help keep Japan on his good side. Obviously, I think the relationship is, the real relationship is much more complicated than that, and there are people at USTR and Treasury and State Department that are trying to give a more accurate picture to the president of the Japan-U.S. relationship. But it's been remarked that Donald Trump somehow seems to have a 1970s view of Asia and Japan, so he remembers the tremendous trade tensions, and sometimes, no matter how many times he's told that things have substantially changed, he still regards Japan in the way that Japan was regarded by a lot of people in the United States decades ago. And but you have to look at the bottom line of what the trade imbalance is. The other thing is obviously Trump rejected TPP, which is something that Japan and the United States worked on very, very hard, and the majority of business leaders in both countries were very much in support of. And you know, there's all sorts of buzz about so-called free trade agreements. And I was just in Taiwan, and they would like to have a free trade agreement with the United States, and Trump likes those sort of agreements too. So I haven't been up day to day on sort of what's happening in the bilateral trade relationship as far as negotiations go. Some of you in the room probably know much more about that than I am. But if you have questions about it for the president or the press secretary in future, send me an email. I asked him, much to the delight of my Japanese colleagues, I wasn't the president. I asked Sarah Sanders about when the bowling ball test resurfaced, where Trump had made a remark that the Japanese were dropping a bowling ball on the roof or trunks of imported U.S. cars, and that's why U.S. cars could not be brought into Japan, which was something that wasn't accurate. But I did ask Sarah Sanders about that one. So.
Yes, sir.
I know I'm going to have a tough question from Jordan here.
Hi, I'm Jordan Plateris. I'm a civilian. Steve, I'm assuming that you followed the president to many of his rallies around the country. And during these rallies, as I see on the press, that he tries to rile up the crowd and points out the press and threatens them, or tries to get to incite bad feelings and possibly violence against the press. Do you ever, under these circumstances, feel personal danger? And during these moments in Air Force One, when the president comes back, does anybody ever bring this up to the president and ask him to lay off that kind of stuff?
Okay, answering the second part first. There have been off-the-record discussions with the president about this, including some editors of the New York Times, which subsequently leaked out. So, yes, it has been addressed to the president. In answer to the first part, I have been to a number of the rallies. You cannot really get the feel, the sensation of the electricity in the air from watching it on TV. You have to remember this crowd is being amped up for 90 minutes, 2 hours in advance with music at a rock concert level amplitude. In fact, I think the most dangerous thing of attending these rallies is the possibility of hearing loss rather than getting attacked by any of his fans. But the way that I've sort of looked at these rallies by being at them, it is an extension of Trump's reality television. It's similar to what we used to call in the States big-time wrestling. I think now it's, what is it, WWF or whatever, where there's a good guy and a bad guy, or a good woman and a bad woman in this, on the stage or in the ring, and 99.99% of the people attending know that it's fake, and not to believe everything you're seeing or hearing. And so for his base, they're not so concerned about the facts in his rhetoric. It's entertainment. It's a show. And the press is playing the role of the bad guy. Why do I say that? Because at the end, if Jim Acosta is there after they've been yelling and screaming fake news, they come up to him and want his autograph.
So it's less than 2 years, I guess, 16 months or so, until November of 2020, yeah? The election, yeah. So kind of, to some degree, and I know it was before you got back to the States, Trump kind of surprised people within the Republican Party in the primaries in that they didn't expect him to succeed. and he made it through, and beyond that was elected president. Do you see, again, in the primary season, any Republican challenger emerging? Conversely, is there anyone, I think we had Elizabeth Warren step up that she was entertaining a Democratic bid? Who might be the Democratic challengers in a very, normally with 16 months to go, we know who's already raised their hand.
Right.
It doesn't seem like people have their hand up.
Okay. This is getting a little bit outside my area of expertise because I wasn't there in person for the except for the very end of the 2016 race. But as someone who's been back in the country and watching this on a day-to-day basis for a couple of years, I have some observations. First of all, on the Republican side, it certainly would be prudent of someone to run as a primary challenger because just in case, for whatever reason, that one day Donald Trump is no longer the candidate for the Republican Party, although maybe the odds of that are 100 or 500 to 1 that he would not be still running as of Election Day. So, Kasich from Ohio, one name that is mentioned, Jeff Flake, is another. But the thing is, the RNC, Republican National Committee, I believe, has been merged with the Trump re-election campaign. So they're certainly not going to get any even-handed support from the Republican Party. On the Democratic side, look, we're going to have at least 20 prominent Democrats running in the primary or forming exploratory committees. Elizabeth Warren has already done that. Joe Biden is going to make an announcement very soon. Looks like he'll run because after 2016, Donald Trump demonstrated that you can be very unconventional and still get elected president of the United States. It doesn't matter how well financed your opponent is. It doesn't matter that you have any sort of experience at governing, although most of those who will be running will be politicians on the Democratic side, and I would expect, besides Elizabeth Warren and possibly Joe Biden, maybe Beto O'Rourke will take a shot at it. Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, U.S. Senator, who came to prominence because of her stance at the Kavanaugh hearing. Kamala Harris from California, U.S. Senator. Eric Garcetti, former mayor of Los Angeles, is another name. And it could be a real dark horse that ends up with the nomination for a few reasons. Also, I should say there are a few billionaires. Michael Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, Mark Cuban, who owns the Dallas Mavericks, because they can do the same thing that Trump did. They can ignore the polls. They can self-finance the campaign, and they can, even if they do not perform well in the early primaries, caucuses, they can stay in the race for much longer than someone who performs poorly at the very beginning. The other thing to watch, and there's been a lot of criticism about how the media looks at these contests as a bit of a horse race. But using the horse race model, let's say after the first leg, a candidate who was predicted to get 3% in an early primary gets 6%. They're now going to get a lot more media attention, which means they'll get more money. And so someone who was very obscure at the beginning could gain momentum that way. For the general election, the caveat I would throw out there is there's a lot of concern that to successfully run against Trump, that you need a Democrat, a moderate, probably a white male, who can attract other white males in swing states to come out on election day who might otherwise sit at home like they did in 2016 or vote for Trump because they don't like the woman on the ballot, okay? Well, there's a definite degree of sexism there, and that's something to take into consideration. The other thing I would also throw out there, just as Trump lost the popular vote but won the electoral vote, because of Trump being on the ballot as the Republican nominee and perhaps a left-of-center candidate for the Democrats, you could have a relatively strong third-party candidate jump in, who obviously cannot win, but can take just enough votes in swing states to alter the outcome of the election. So again, you could have someone, Trump or the Democratic challenger, not win the popular vote, but win the electoral vote. And that's something no one's talking about right now, is almost certain, and Donald Trump or the Democratic candidate, depending on how things play out, may enjoy having the third-party candidate in the mix, hoping that it'll swing things, tip things their way in the general election. So, yeah, if you thought 2016 was a nail-biter and unconventional and crazy, just wait till 2020.
All right. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Associate member, name is Kuo. Thank you for the very interesting
My
presentation. My question is maybe a little philosophical. All the things which is happening in the United States and what President Donald Trump does, is American democracy changing? Is it deteriorating? For instance, a person who doesn't make record of making any contribution to society, country, or public, becomes a president. Another area is that American people are spending something like almost 2 years for the presidential election. Who runs the company, the country? Mm-hmm. These are the questions that I have, and the basic question is it changing or stable or deteriorating? I'd like your opinion on that.
Okay,
thing.
sure. Excellent questions. On the one aspect of that, I think most presidents, the last 2 years of their first term are running for re-election. So I don't think that's anything new. As to the first part of the question, you have to remember we have 3 branches of government in the United States. The executive branch is quite powerful, but it does share power with the legislative branch. And in that legislative branch now, we have the House, the lower house, in the hands of the opposition party, who will be starting a whole array of investigations into this administration, and also possible impeachment proceedings. So you have that sort of check on the presidency. And then we have the judicial branch as well. And as we have seen, there are judges that have ruled against this administration. And we've even had an interesting vote or two in the Supreme Court with John Roberts making decisions that definitely did not please the president. So I would say have faith in the American system. It is definitely, I think no one would contest that this is a stress test for the American system. But we have a constitution which is held up quite well with some glitches, And eventually, when we've had egregious constitutional violations, such as the internment of Japanese American citizens in World War II, there was eventually redress for that. So I do have confidence. President Trump was fairly elected. He did not take office as a result of some coup or even a hanging Chad. And there is another election coming up in 2020, and there was an election last year, and the opposition party picked up 40 seats, which I think was a lot more than almost anybody had predicted. So we're in trying times, and as I said before, I do think there is some sort of paradigm shift going on globally, but I'm a journalist, I'm not a historian, and I don't claim to know what to call it or how it's going to end up. But just like you, I'm watching this on a day-to-day basis and wondering what is going to happen.
Yes, sir.
I admire your reporting. I follow you on Facebook and so. My question is, I'm a European guy. I'm born in Vienna, in Austria, in the middle of Europe, and Trump is reported to have said that Europe is his foe, and his ambassador in Berlin, he meets up with right-wing people throughout Europe, and he's for Brexit. And so, does he want chaos in Europe, or what's his relationship, or doesn't he care? Or
yeah, I don't know. Obviously, he has been confrontational with NATO, and I think I don't think, I know that he does not like or perhaps understand the EU model, because he has said to Angela Merkel more than once that he wants to negotiate directly with Germany on trade, and doesn't seem to accept the EU bloc. So yes, if Trump had his way, he would prefer to negotiate directly on trade with EU members. And I suspect he probably has a certain amount of sympathy with Brexit, because it's the UK pulling out of a multilateral agreement, which Trump has consistently done as well. Beyond that, I really don't know. And I would say one thing that has changed, when there was somebody who asked about people coming and going in the White House, there has been a tremendous amount of churn. And while we have lost now the three generals who a lot of people saw as sort of the sort of a rock of stability, some sort of buffer against the president's worst instincts, we can also say that when you're talking about nationalists, isolationists, Steve Bannon is out of the White House and isn't talking in the president's ear every single day. Steve Miller, who is very much of an influential figure on the immigration policy, is still there and does have a tremendous amount of influence. And I've said I can tell when Donald Trump is reading paragraphs that Steve Miller has written, because he sort of unconsciously starts to imitate Steve Miller's voice, and it's quite a tell. Oh, one other thing, just a little bit of an inside observation. When we go into the Oval Office, and during the Obama administration, these pool sprays, as they're called, would last about 45 seconds, because Obama wouldn't say anything, to be a handshake, and it was for the photographers, and we all be ushered out of there. And now, of course, they last 45 minutes sometimes. But when Trump is really done, just in case you ever play poker with him, when he's really done and that's it, he's not going to answer any more questions, he's upset, he folds his arms like this, and he says, thank you, and his tongue goes between his teeth when he says the TH sound. So that means he's really done. I know at that point he's not going to answer any more questions. So, Trump is very transparent, and I do take him at his word when he said something. That's another thing. People said, oh, he's going to moderate when he's going to become more presidential, and he's going to moderate on his policies. And I think what we've seen is he really does want to implement what he's saying, that yes, at some point he may back off, like with the Syria policy where he kind of got backed into a corner on that. But do take him at his word. When he says something about the EU, whether it makes sense or not, but believe that this is what he believes and is what he wants to happen. I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer on that.
All right, kind of wrapping up with hopefully a question that'll begin or end where we began. And 2019, not an election year in the States, but Japan will host the G20 this year. And there's a lot on the diplomatic front that may happen before that. And financial markets are rolling of late with a sense the yen's appreciated quite sharply just in the last couple of weeks or so.
Bad timing for my trip.
There you go. So to crystal ball, to the degree of what might be on the table via the G20, I guess number one, would Trump even attend? Question mark, or does Mike Pence make an appearance again? What do you see as kind of the key, if you had to bullet point 3 things that will be to be discussed at that time?
Well, on G20, Trump did attend we were just in Buenos Aires. Pence got sent for, what was it, EAS, APEC, ASEAN. And, maybe Trump was not enthusiastic about going to Papua New Guinea. You can figure out where that one falls in his list of countries. Actually, Trump has made public remarks, as best as I can interpret them, that he is planning to come here twice this year, not only for the G20, but for I was just looking up the proper word in Japanese yesterday for this, because the new emperor takes over on May 1st, but then it's enthronement ceremony that is held in...
It'll be October is the formal event. Yeah.
Right. So there was one where everybody's going to be invited. So Trump made a comment where it appeared he was saying he would also attend that. Now, that would be kind of unusual, 2 trips to Japan in a very short time. And where else might he go during these trips? Is a matter of some speculation. But yes, I'm expecting him to be here at least once and perhaps twice during this year. I have to say, after attending countless G7s, G20s, APECs, ASEANs, EAS, what else is out there? IMFs and SARCs, and that from a news perspective, the real news tends to be the bilateral meetings, the one-on-ones. And I've sort of given up on, especially with this administration now, and you also have the Chinese factoring into a lot of these meetings where it's very difficult to get a communique at the end of it that means anything whatsoever, right? So these meetings are, I think, more and more are just showcases lacking in substance, and the real drama, the real news comes out of the bilateral meetings, which will tend to deal with whatever short-term crises are on the table. And you're much more of an expert on the G7 than I am, but and so Mnuchin has been showing up at these things, and pretty much trying to pursue a policy of following in America first without overly antagonizing our traditional allies too much. But considering how many months away the G20 is, I mean, who knows what our major crises are going to be. And you mentioned, the markets are definitely, gyrating a lot. And then we also have to look at, one thing you can say, and I think is inarguable so far, if you look at the data, when you're looking at the jobs numbers and the trade data, it has been favoring this administration. And arguably, a lot of economists were saying, well, this was all a result of the policies that were put in place during the Obama administration. But if these numbers hold in the third and fourth year of a Trump administration, then I think that argument becomes much more difficult, and that Trump and his administration will be able to make a much stronger case that they can take credit for this. And then the key really is, if you're talking about these swing states in the 2020 election, where whatever people may think of Donald Trump personally, do they feel that things are going well for them with their paycheck? So personalities aside, in 2020, that's always been foreign policy decisions. I mean, that's the thing. We sit here in Japan and, microscopically examine all of this on a day-to-day basis. But a construction worker in Peoria, Illinois, or a homemaker, in Roswell, New Mexico, are not looking at Japan, U.S., trade numbers. They're looking at the household budget. And if they fear that a Democrat or Donald Trump is going to be more of a danger to what they have, or which one they put more hope in, that's what probably still, despite everything we've been through, that probably will determine the outcome of the 2020 election. But I would just say there's an old Arab proverb that says only a fool believes he can predict the future. So I would be foolish if I could make a confident assessment of the 2020 election. But I can tell you, speaking recently to high-ranking European diplomats in Washington, D.C., that, because this is part of their job, they are reporting back to their capitals that they believe Trump will be reelected.
All right. Well, with that, we'll conclude our Asa-kai breakfast this morning. Thank you very much for your questions and your attention. And most of all, thank you to our speaker, Steve Herman. Cheers.
Thank you. And you are not allowed to present me with an honorary membership, because I'm a lifetime member of this club, whether you like it or not.
Steve is going to take a tour of the place and compare it to our Yuracho Denki building premises. But it does give me the opportunity to note that Hacks and Flax will be held on the 25th of January this month, our annual communications and media evening. I hope all of you can make it that night. Thank you.
Thank you.